The roads surrounding St. George's Fields had been cordoned off before our arrival. To the residents of Southwark, the footfalls of our approaching squadron must have carried a portentous air. I must confess to a touch of agitation as we advanced down the Lambeth Road. Though many of the present officers had been military men at some point, I had never seen war. Thus, I could not help but feel out of place amidst the marching ranks of my brethren and the rumbling treads of the Templars. It was just after 8 o'clock by the time we arrived before the hospital grounds. It was a cloudless night, but no moon shone above the city. D.I. Marsden, who was leading the raid, gave the order over the bullhorn for the gate to be opened, and when no response came, he called for the bolt cutters. We proceeded onto the grounds, rifles and shields raised. The stone and columned facade of Bedlam stood out grim and baleful beneath the cold glow of the arc lamps in rows across the sanitarium's wide lawn. From the distant steps of the edifice to the farthest extent of its grounds, we could all mark an unsettling absence of any of Raspel's automata. Perhaps the doctor had fled when her robotic assailant failed to return with Lord Altonshaw's head. We moved forward along the cobbled drive, preceded by Marsden and the 3 armored Templars. We were midway across when a heavy metallic sound echoed from beneath the hospital's looming dome. We held position where we stood and stared, awestruck, as the steeple atop the dome receded from sight amidst the innotations of gargantuan turning gears and belts, and in its place there rose a structure resembling a Tesla wireless tower with a hollow, rotating brass hemisphere atop its copper-coiled secondary. It reached its eminence with a fastening clang, and from its rotating topload there spat forth a corona of crackling arcs that split the air with deafening thunder. Suddenly, the 3 robust Templar units at the front of our assembly began to seize and jolt, as if in some violent mechanical paroxysm. Sparks flew from the spaces between their armor. Those of us who were closest to the Templars drew back and raised our shields. In an instant the jarring convulsion ceased, and the Templars' heavy limbs lowered and their chassis slouched forward. Wisps of smoke began to rise intermittently from the helmets of the still machines. We stood, dumbfounded. Somehow, the strange coil device atop the hospital's dome had shorted out the Templars' analytical engines from over 200 feet away. Our artillery had been utterly immobilized. We weren't given the opportunity to recognize the gravity of our predicament, for all at once it became all the more dire. The grid of arc lamps illuminating the grounds was extinguished, and in an instant we were engulfed in pitch blackness. Inspector Marsden called out for us to hold position. I believe he was about to order us to keep our shields raised, when his voice trailed off into a grisly wail of agony. There was a split second of stark dread before the darkness erupted into blood-soaked, nightmarish chaos. The air was rent with the sound of clashing metal and the frantic cries of my fellow officers. The intermittent flashes of our blind gunfire revealed the mechanical scourge that besieged us. Raspel's automata, blades extended, had descended upon our ranks like silent wolves, bred for wholesale extermination. We had foolishly marched straight into an ambush. Within the flashes I caught unforgiving sight of such untempered carnage which I cannot bring myself to describe. I wish I could say that I acted courageously, but surrounded by slaughter and stricken with panic, my instinct drove me to the ground. Not entirely bereft of wit, I had the wherewithal to place my ballistic shield across my back. Like a soldier, I crawled, blindly, away from the sound of the bloodbath. Though the blackness was complete, I kept my eyes tightly shut. Would that I could have blocked my other senses as well. The harrowing screams of the dying officers, the clicking, whirring, hissing of the automata's movements, the aimless firing of rifles, the clatter and grind of metal on metal, the crunching of bone, the cleaving of flesh, the iron scent of blood in the air. It was like an abattoir. After what seemed an eternity of crawling, my helmet struck something hard. I opened my eyes, but saw only shadows. Reaching my hand out, I could feel a wall of stone. I had reached the hospital. As I darted my eyes in every direction, desperate to find some means of shelter, my vision began to acclimatize, and I caught sight of a dim reflection of gunfire some ways along the wall. Inching closer, I saw that it was a window to the asylum's cellar. It was short and narrow, and there was an iron grate bolted over it, but I knew it would only be a matter of time before the robotic butchers discovered me. I had my battering ram. Using every desperate ounce of strength that I could muster, I pounded against the bolts until enough of them had broken for me to pry back the bars. Breaking the glass and discarding my shield, for it was too wide to fit through, I shimmied through the window and dropped to the floor. The corridor in which I found myself was just as dark as it had been outside, but I kept my hand against the cold stone wall, feeling for a light switch as I crept along. The pandemonium without was muffled now, and I listened, deftly, my carbine raised, for any approaching threat. I could not have counted the devils outside, but if even one automaton remained inside the hospital, I did not want to find it. After about 20 paces I came to a door. Putting my ear against it, I could hear no movement nor speech from within. But a moment later, I detected the unmistakable sound of footsteps at the opposite end of the corridor. Swiftly I ducked inside and shut the door behind me. I held my breath, in terrible expectancy, as the footsteps passed. As they neared the door, I marked that they were not the footfalls of any metal body. Nevertheless, I could not imagine anyone that I would wish to meet in such a madhouse. Once I was certain they had gone, I tried calling over my radio for reinforcements, but neither answer nor crackling static came in response. The singular contraption that had disabled the Templars had also knocked out my radio. The vehement uproar on the hospital's lawn would undoubtedly draw the attention of the authorities and bring further aid, but I would have to find my own way back to sanity. Presently I resolved to ascertain my bearings. Feeling around the frame of the door, I found a switchbox and turned on the lights. The room was walled with the same bleak green and white tiles, and half lit by the same dim phosphorescent lamps as the rest of the hospital, but I could tell by its contents that it was an operating lab. There was a row of sinks against one wall, before which stood a table spread with trays of sinister, unnameable surgical instruments. In the darker corner of the room I could just make out a desk stacked neatly with papers and what looked like a large metal refrigeration cabinet. At the center of the room, in place of an operating table, there was a chair, of the sort one would expect to be used by a dentist or a barber, but far more nefarious. There were leather straps on the arm and leg rests, and in place of a headrest there was an unnerving metal clamp obviously designed to hold the subject's head in place. Mounted on the ceiling was an array of articulated metal appendages, each with a different implement at its tip. No doubt the apparatus for Dr. Raspel's surgery. These were the instruments for implanting the subcranial oscillation receptors. I did not look long at these instruments, for the longer I stared at them, the more I began to imagine the details of the procedure in graphic imagery. Turning away from the chair, I moved to the desk in the dim corner of the lab. The stacks of paper I found had been printed from a telegraphone receiver. Taking a page off of each stack, I turned towards the light and began to read. When the events of that awful night had concluded, I returned to the operating lab and collected every sheet I could find. I logged these documents into evidence the very next day, but my superiors refused to acknowledge their true pertinence to this case, or to the potential lingering menace that may yet rise up again to terrorize the public good. The following passages are those that I believe bear the most relevance to the case at hand, taken from several pages of 4 separate records. 10-3-2631. Subject M5G47 exhibits momentary anomalous lapses in visual depth perception. Perambulatory navigation impaired. Increasing surveillance to monitor for persistence of malfunction. 14-3-2631. Subject experiences sporadic disruption of auditory receptors. Integration threatened. Possible extraction required. 16-3-2631. Subject experiences complete loss of visual and auditory perception. Integration compromised. Retrieving module for diagnostics. 29-3-2631. Subject F6G91 displays regular spasms of lower extremities. Integration threatened. Increasing surveillance to monitor for persistence of malfunction. 31-3-2631. Subject exhibits complete loss of cognizant function. Consistent operation limited to attempted vertical propulsion. Integration compromised. Retrieving module for diagnostics. 9-4-2631. Subject M9G08 experiences violent spasm in left lower extremity. Malfunction in close proximity to potential witness. Integration compromised. Retrieving module for diagnostics. 18-4-2631. Subject M1G72 displays violent destructive convulsion in right upper extremity. Injury done to witness after attempted intervention. Integration failed. Retrieving module for diagnostics. I needn't remark upon the significance of the dates attached to these reports. It was indisputable now that Raspel had been behind the murders, and the reports corresponding with mid-March suggested a connection to the train crash as well. Her sentinels had been following the discharged patients, keeping tabs on their integration into society, and if any of them began to show signs of abnormal behavior. But why? Why kill them? Simply to preserve the reputation of Raspel's treatment? And why take the heads? Such action had only aided the Yard in connecting the victims. Decapitation is typically employed as a means of concealing the victim's identity. Perhaps in this case the heads were taken to conceal something else. Dr. Raspel had distorted the registration of her automata. Perhaps the extent of her deceit did not end there. If she had similarly tampered with her patients' records to simulate the success of a baseless therapy, then an autopsy would have proved it. Determined to find additional evidence, I looked about the laboratory for anything that could have passed off as the doctor's sympathetic oscillator. Immediately I was drawn to the large metal cabinet in the corner. The handle was locked, but one swift strike with the butt of my rifle removed it. I carefully drew open the door and screamed in horror at what lay behind it. The cabinet was indeed meant for refrigeration, for inside it, staring at me with 3 pairs of glossy, lifeless eyes, were the severed heads of Morris Drummond, Eileen Eversley, and Harold Thorne, the final, damning proof of Raspel's guilt. This discovery, according to the official statement issued by Scotland Yard, was regarded as the investigation's conclusion. The public was informed of the fraudulent registration of the automata, the presence of the victims' heads in the hospital cellar, but this was all. So much of what I uncovered in that God-forsaken madhouse, at the risk of my own life, has been suppressed. Chief Inspector Stevenson says that it is not our business and that we are not equipped to deal with such matters. He is afraid, and I do not blame him. But I cannot forget what I now know. There are over 100 of Dr. Raspel's subjects still living in Britain, if a word such as living can be used, and over 300 that remain in Bedlam. And beyond this, who can say? I cannot turn a blind eye to what I saw. My conscience cannot bear the weight of so many abominations. Had the heads in the cabinet been merely severed from their bodies, I would not have screamed. But this was not the extent of their incompleteness. The crowns of all 3 heads had been removed by some surgical instrument similar to that used in their decapitation, and seated in the hollow of their skulls was nothing of nature's making. In place of a brain, there was an integrated conglomeration of altogether bewildering mechanisms. Ornate brass framed the design of the most intricate combination of clockwork movements I had ever seen. Cogs and spurs and sprockets of every size and shape meshed together across axles and carriages that overlapped and intersected in labyrinthine fashion. A multitude of springs, coils, and armatures bespoke a variety of inconceivable functions. There were copper wires that ran through canals in the bone, apparently connecting to the eyes and eardrums, and in the center of the apparatus there was a helical copper coil extending downwards to where it would have met the spine. It was the most advanced analytical engine I had ever seen, and when the coroner uncovered the same apparatus in Lord Altonshaw's head 2 days later, He averred that it would classify as a Type 70 model at the very least. Heretofore unprecedented. A machine engineered to fully replicate the infinite operations of the human brain. I was so horrified at the sight that I did not notice that I was no longer alone in the laboratory until the door behind me shut.